Hello, welcome to this podcast. So, I was just reflecting on the life of Daniel, you know, and it is very, very interesting. We read about Daniel, and we're amazed by what he did and stuff. But when you take time to read carefully, then you get to see such an excellent and outstanding young man who is worthy to be talked about. So I was imagining when Daniel was being taken to captivity in Babylon. He was a teenager. Scholars have said that he must have been about 17 years old. So he was a teenager and he was taken to Babylon, as captive, and they were serving the king. And during the time of their training, which took about 3 years, where it was a time of preparation for them to be trained in the culture of the Babylon and stuff like that, before they could officially serve the king, they had to eat from the king's table. There were choice food. I'm talking about meat. I'm talking about, just the kind of food like maybe you'll find in a buffet, good quality food, especially the proteins where it was concerned, that was given to the trainees who were supposed to serve the king. And Daniel, being a teenager, didn't want to defile himself with that food, because what happened is that, the Babylonian culture would serve gods, the idols, and they would offer their food, to the idols first. And Daniel didn't want to defile himself by eating this food. So he refused to eat the food and instead requested the chief official if they could instead eat vegetables and fruits, instead of that food, which included meat, and just trying to apply it in today's time. Like, you're a teenager and you're being offered meat and fish and chicken and all kinds of, nice things, but you refuse in exchange of vegetables and water for God. How many teenagers can do that? Leave alone teenagers, even just you and I as Christians, as believers. If you went somewhere and meat was brought in a platter and, it's pork or it's a wet fry, whatever it is, and you're saying, and then you're told this food was actually first offered to a certain idol. Most of us will just go like, let's just pray for it, it will be sanctified, and you go ahead and eat. You wouldn't even think for a minute that I shouldn't eat this food. Maybe we should just request something else. But here, it was a teenager who was so devoted and committed to God that he refused to eat meat and good food, in exchange of vegetables and fruits, so that he will not defile himself. Just look at that level of commitment. Just look at that level of devotion to God, that he was ready to leave everything else for God, even his stomach, which is something many people struggle with, truthfully be told. Most of the time, people work for their stomach, And this is something that a teenager did. It took a lot of sacrifice and just value to God to be able to do that. And today I just wanted to challenge you and I to have the kind of devotion that Daniel had toward his God. That he was ready to give up, the pleasures of his body and for his life just because of God. And that was not the only time that Daniel did such an outstanding thing, in his time. Even when he was promoted as an administrator, he was now a ruler and had power and position, in that region. And, King Nebuchadnezzar, who was the king at that time, created this gold statue of an idol, and he made everybody bow to it. They said, if you hear the sounds of the flute, the trumpet, every kind of musical instruments, that you're supposed to bow down and worship it. But of course, Daniel, with a heart after God, the devoted man of God, did not want to bow down to that. And so it happened that he had his colleagues, some, administrators, and I believe some, just some of his colleagues who were envious of him and they were jealous of Daniel, and they wanted to put him in trouble. And so they decided, to catch him when he's praying to his God and report him to the king, so that, he will be executed. And at that time, the punishment was being thrown into the lion's den. But guess what? That did not shake Daniel. He still went ahead and prayed to the God of the Israelites, the God that he knew. And when he was caught, he was, of course, alishikwa, and he was being taken to the lion's den and everything. So I can imagine at that time when Daniel was being escorted, whether he was being manhandled to the lion's den, if it was today's believer or today's person, just general. I can imagine if it was, in today's time that someone is being escorted to the lion's den. For most people, I tend to believe that for most people, during that time when they're being escorted to the lion's den, they'll be like, okay, I'm sorry, I won't do this again, I'll not worship the idol. Because at this point, there's no return. At this point, you're going to be executed, you're going to die. Like, there's no plan B. But Daniel, we don't read anywhere in the Bible where Daniel pleaded for his life or pleaded, to be released. He still went on, even knowing that he was going to die. Just look at that, the kind of devotion and commitment that Daniel had. He was ready to lose his power, his position as an administrator, as a ruler in the region for God. Not only that, he was ready to lose his own life. Like, not just money, not just power, but even his own life, for God. That's the kind of devotion and commitment that God desires that we have of him. And I tend to think that somehow that also contributed to the kind of favor that Daniel had. Because Daniel did have favor in Babylon. He was so much highly favored by God. He had favor with the king, favor, with the rulers in position. And so also that tells you just, that tells you that, the degree to which you serve God and are committed to his will, he will also reciprocate, his favor towards your life according to that measure, and even more, even beyond. So this was just an encouragement to us, an eye-opener to us, a challenge to us as believers, who many times we say we are believers, but when it comes to self-denial, that's where the problem begins. Because we love God with our mouth, we love God, for as long as we are not affected in any way. We love God for as long as there's no sacrifice involved. We love God for as long as we don't get to lose anything. But would you love God at risk of losing your job in the workplace? Would you love God at risk of losing your own life? Would you love God at risk of losing power, position, authority, whatever it is? Now, just imagine that you're in position of power, or rather you're working, whether it's in government. So now just imagine that you are, you're working at your workplace and you notice something outrageous that happens that is not right. And, your spirit man, urges you to report that issue, or to do something about it. But because you fear losing your job, you fear losing the position that you're at or you're in, you fear all these things. So what happens? You keep quiet. But if it was Daniel in your shoes, you will go ahead and do the right thing. So this word is for someone who you're supposed to do the right thing, whether it's at your workplace, but you're afraid. Maybe you feel you lose your job, maybe something will happen. But I want to challenge you to take a risk and do what is right before God. And God will fight for you. We don't know the outcome, whether God will keep you, God will take you out of there, but we know God will do what is right. So just do what God is asking you to do. You could be in position of power in government, maybe, and there's corruption and there are things happening, and, you want to speak out, you want to do the right thing, but you're afraid if you do that, you may be fired, you may lose that job that has so much money, and you have this life that you've put for your family, and you're wondering what will happen, You're wondering the kind of ridicule that you may get from other people because of that. But let me tell you, if it's anything that is going to glorify God, go ahead and do it. Daniel was ready to lose his own life, not just money and wealth and power, but life for God. May we be willing and ready to love God to the extent that we are ready to lose anything just because of him. Today, pray for grace and strength to be devoted believers to God. Be blessed.